Hi everyone, and welcome back to another video. So this is going to be my books from July, and luckily I only read 2 books, so I'm hoping this video will be a little bit shorter than my other ones. But before I get started, I wanted to give a shout out to one of my viewers from last month's video. She left some really interesting comments that were just her reactions and insights to what I had talked about in the books that I had read. So I really appreciated that. Shout out to Lillian So. Thank you for watching, and I hope you're watching this video. I'm also filming from a different location. I'm basically at my work from home setup, so I'm at my work desk. And if you've ever been on a Zoom call with me, this is the background that you get to see every single time. Does it look professional? I hope so. Okay, so the first book I want to talk about is called Circe. This came out in 2018, and it was written by Madeline Miller. This was my book club book. And it's a retelling of Circe's story. So if you remember in the Odyssey, Circe is one of the witches that Odysseus encounters. Basically, Odysseus and his men become shipwrecked on this island, which is Circe's island, and Circe uses her witchcraft to turn his men into animals, into swine, into lions, and Odysseus basically has to use his wits and try and figure out how to outsmart Circe and be on his way home to Penelope, his wife. So what Madeline does is she actually ends up recounting a lot of different Greek myths. So familiar characters like Athena, Hermes, Helios, which is Circe's father, the god of the sun, the stories of Daedalus, like the father of Icarus, and kind of the whole Minotaur fable with Ariadne, Jason and Medea, a bunch of different Greek myths. And the unifying thread is that we're seeing Circe's life from when she was a child to beyond. And all of these different stories actually kind of come together and have some connection to Circe that obviously doesn't actually exist, but is kind of cleverly packaged together into one story. For me, that sometimes felt a bit forced. I think with this book, if you're someone who really loves Greek mythology, and on top of that, you have a very strong emotional connection to these stories, like you feel very strongly about them and they make you feel some kind of way, you're gonna love this. You know, part of me just couldn't really buy that actually in all of these really well-known Greek myths, there was a Circe angle to it. And I think what Madeline Miller was trying to do is give this character that we already know through one lens new life and really a voice. And there's definitely a really empowering thing that's going on in telling Circe's story. But that's something that's very easy for me to buy into. And I feel like that was almost low-hanging fruit. I wanted more. But I didn't think it was enough that we were just seeing a different side. And especially because Madeline packed in so many of these other Greek myths. If you're going to use Greek myths as your vehicle of storytelling, I think it needs to be done in service of something much more inventive or new or fresh. And I feel like that's the project, right? Because otherwise, it's just a bit restrictive to have to use these myths because we already know the plot, we already know the characters, and it's really up to the author who's taking this on to do something new and creative. I feel like the stakes are quite low when you're reading about gods. They don't really grow up, they don't really change at all. They're always going to act in the same way. So that's why I feel like if you're going to choose Greek myths as your vehicle for storytelling, I don't know, just more sophistication, I guess, again, in terms of how the gods as characters are treated in this novel. She definitely is using them as a foil to mortals. And one of the unique characteristics of Circe is that she's able to empathize, whereas most gods don't really care at all and are quite brutal. So she's different from them. She also comes from a very lowly class because she's a nymph. Her witchcraft, which you wouldn't know this from reading the Odyssey, is something that she's had to teach herself and learn. It's very tedious. And I do think the book really shines when it really hits on the various milestones of Circe becoming a strong, empowered person and very confident in herself. And one of my favorite quotes from the book gets to that point. I really like the female friendship, yay, female friendship, between Penelope and Circe. In this book, which I really love, they support and respect each other by the end of it. They don't start out that way. And Penelope also is a badass. Like, she's portrayed as a very strong and centered woman. But one of my favorite quotes comes from when Circe is offering to let Penelope use her loom, and she says, "I looked at her, as vivid in my doorway as the moon in the autumn sky. Her eyes held mine, gray and steady. It is a common saying that women are delicate creatures, flowers, eggs, anything that may be crushed in a moment's carelessness. If I had ever believed it, I no longer did." Okay, let's rate this. I'm going to give this a 3.5 out of 5. Hopefully I did a good job of explaining why this wasn't my favorite book. I liked reading it. Like, I'm not going to be a hater, but I think for me, if it's going to be a retelling, if it's going to use stuff I already know, it has to really hit it out of the ballpark. It has to really elevate it and really bring something new and mind-blowing, or else I'm going to be pretty skeptical. The next book I read is a book about Singapore. It came highly recommended to me from a few different people, so I was really excited to read it. It's called The Naysayers Book Club, and it's an anthology of interviews of 26 Singaporeans by Simon Vincent. This is obviously a very wide-ranging book when it comes to subject matter, so I think this quote from the introduction sums it up best. This book is aimed at reflecting the spectrum of naysaying, and through the variegated anecdotes connecting the political, the social, the cultural, the economic, and the personal. The naysayers here include architects, academics, journalists, artists, and activists. The faces are young and old, and the voices radical and temperate. There are two frameworks that Simon Vincent uses in this book. The first is obviously the naysayer idea, and I really like that he included so many different interpretations of what it means to be a naysayer in Singaporean society. So you range from folks who are really working within the state system and within what's allowed, and maybe working on less sensitive issues like conservation or things like that, to the opposite end of the spectrum, where there are interviews of people who have protested, who have been sent to jail, who have challenged the state version of history, and they're quite radical. I can imagine loads of other people that he could interview for the next volume. I don't know if he's working on a second volume, but reading these stories just opened up so many other ideas of other people I'd love to see interviewed. The second framework that he uses, which I don't really think he needed another framework, and it's kind of overwhelming, to be honest, but it's also a book club, right? So he asks everybody he interviews for their recommended books and for their book list, and he also takes a picture of them in front of a bookshelf or like their personal book collection. I do think, as someone who's making YouTube videos about books and who loves book clubs, obviously I love reading lists, and I loved all of the recommended reading that I got out of reading this, but I'm not sure it really added too much more to the stories or the interviewees. It was kind of a little bit of a hack. I think it's really great that Simon Vincent isn't just providing a transcript of his conversations with these people. Instead, he does kind of have the role of an editor, and he has the responsibility of providing context, and throughout you can kind of see instances in where he does fact check, or he does provide additional footnotes or information that would help contextualize and also verify what you're hearing from the interviewee. I think that one pitfall that expats or foreign observers could fall into when they first move to Singapore, if you're not already heavily in the camp of this is Disneyland with the death penalty and like, oh, this is such an authoritarian state, and instead you come here and you see how high functioning it is, and you just are enamored by how competent Singapore is, you may fall into this kind of comparison game where if someone points out a problem about Singapore, you say, yeah, but it's great for 95% of the people that live here. And look at the US, that's such a dumpster fire. And I think one of the great things that this book does is point, or maybe this is just a realization I came to, but what I believe is it's not that useful to compare like that. I think it's good to have perspective and have things in context, but I wouldn't want to diminish the work of activists in Singapore. It just seems like a way to shut down the conversation without engaging in the conversation. If you just say, like, why are you complaining? It's much worse in other places. To me, that's a very dishonest line of argumentation. If you're Singaporean and you live in Singapore, it's like your patriotic duty, not to be too dramatic, but it's like your obligation almost to try and make this a better place. And on top of that, there are a lot of like not so great things happening. So there is also an objective argument to be made that a lot of things should be fixed. I also don't really know that much about Operation Cold Store or Operation Spectrum, which are two of the campaigns that Lee Kuan Yew and the PAP led to round up sympathizers. Communist sympathizers is the rationale that the government gave, but there's been a lot of suspicion and counterfactuals that suggest that there wasn't really a communist threat from these people, and instead Lee Kuan Yew just wanted to tamp down any potential opposition so that he could form the government. And in this book, you hear from Teo So Lung, who was detained for 2 years because she was suspected of being a communist sympathizer in Operation Spectrum. And her perspective is interesting because she talks a bit about what younger activists can learn from older activists. And I don't think the Singapore government would ever do anything as heavy-handed as those two campaigns now, but there are still ways of approaching the government or understanding how the government thinks that she believes is useful for younger activists to take into account. I learned about this guy, Tum Pung Jing, for the first time. I think everyone in Singapore already knows him. He is a historian. He produced research where he looked at a lot of different sources and came to the conclusion that the people who were rounded up during Operation Cold Store were not communist sympathizers, and they did not have a plan to try to bring communism to Singapore, because that was really the wedge that Lee Kuan Yew used, is we need to be strong against this threat of communism, and that also resonated with regional neighbors. And he got interrogated by the law minister, Shanmugam, for 5 hours, and I read some articles about it, and it was really fascinating because clearly the government doesn't want any threat to its state narrative, but the fact that this PAP member has to, I mean, all political parties are like this, you have to really buy into the philosophy and the ideology. But the fact that he had to like quibble and argue and interrogate this professor about these minor details, because it gets so granular from what I read in the coverage of the interrogation, was just kind of mind-blowing, and it just seemed like a waste of energy when you could be working on governing the country. I also learned a lot about artists using their art as a form of protest, or who are using their art as a political tool. And through these different interviews, you can get a sense for the space that they play in. And again, there is a strong system of control, but it's not an overt one. And I think that harkens back to Lee Kuan Yew's realization that if you use really heavy-handed tactics, there's going to be a backlash. And so instead, he put together a different system or framework of control that can be just as potent or just as debilitating, but isn't as obvious or overt. I think there are really good examples of that in the media system, and how media is controlled through both market powers, but also using defamation lawsuits to bankrupt activists or dissidents in Singapore. But the area that I was much less familiar with was drama, theater, performance art, comic book art. There's a lot of different people who are interviewed who are doing those professions. And I learned that it isn't so much, I mean, there is outright banning, and you do have to apply for permits to put on plays, and you do have to have content reviewed, and there's definitely all the bureaucracy and red tape of censorship. But for example, Martin See's film called Singapore Rebel, which is about Chee Son-juan, it was banned when it first came out because according to a piece of legislation, you're not allowed to have like political films. But then that law was amended, and so now the film is not banned. And I feel like that is a less heavy-handed approach to what you might expect. You might expect that something that's being called political propaganda would just stay banned, and the governing party would feel that it was an affront to their legitimacy for them to go back on their word. But it's now unbanned, and you can see it. Another example of how the system can really choke artists, but then also give them plenty of space to play, is how funding works. And again, because the government is involved in a lot of different areas of life, I think a lot of artists rely on funding from the National Arts Council or from other government bodies to have a livelihood. And Sunny Liu talks about this. He is the graphic artist who wrote and drew this book called The Art of Charlie Chan Hak Chai, which I'll talk about in next month's video because I read it and it's so good. He tells this whole alternative history of dissidents and opposition parties in Singapore that is not recognized by the PAP. And so the government and the National Arts Council didn't want to acknowledge this book, even though it won the highest honor for graphic novels in the US and globally. And it's a really interesting dynamic because Singapore wants to be respected on the international stage and they want to have a good art scene, but they also are still quite conservative when it comes to allowing artists to truly have free speech or produce art that is evocative or radical. And in his interview, Sunny Liu finally says, this area is too gray and I just am not going to accept any funding from the government anymore. And I think he's at the scale where he can still have a livelihood without that government support. But it's interesting that to him, that's where he draws his line, is he isn't going to accept government funds, whereas in other countries, the line could be much harsher or have a much more devastating impact on your life. I did want to briefly mention, for the public policy person in me, there are also really good interviews with some of the old guard of the more opposition viewpoints when it comes to governance. And there are a couple of interviews with people who have been on the inside and have worked at the government or worked at state-affiliated think tanks or worked at Singaporean universities, and they have really, really interesting thoughts about liberalism, authoritarianism in Singapore, how social policy should work, and kind of the different camps and viewpoints. So I won't go too much into that, but I also found that really intriguing because that's been covered in some of the other books that I've read about Singapore this year. Something that I definitely need to spend time on, though, that I didn't know much about at all, is the state of women's rights, specifically for Malay Muslims in Singapore. I really enjoyed an interview with Filza Sumartono, who works at Aware, and she is working on this project called Gender Equality is Our Culture. And I had no idea, but Sharia law, which is also called Sharia law, which is just Malaysian for Sharia law, is recognized in Singapore. And it's a dual legal system, and you can have disputes or whatnot administered in Muslim courts of law, which is just a fact that I had no idea. So that was one thing I learned. But then secondly, the thing that she's really fighting on is called Sunat Perempuan, which is female genital mutilation, but it's not as severe as in some African countries where they actually quite mutilate the genitalia. In Singapore, it's more just like a nick, but obviously still a violation of women's rights. And her chapter is really interesting because it talks about the intersection of women's rights and religion. But on top of that, in Singapore, that's such a sensitive space. I don't really have anything too sophisticated or enlightened to say about this, except for I'm going to read more. I have a pretty good reading list of like Malay related themes and Islam and Muslim related themes as it relates to Singapore that I can read, but it's a really important point of view. This book just covers so many different topics. It doesn't cover climate change, which I have another book I'm going to read about climate change in Singapore. But anyway, how could he cover everything? I'll just end on a lighter note, I guess, which is this interview with Claire Leo. And she has some really interesting ideas around heritage, conservation, nostalgia, because her project is to try and save Bukit Brown Cemetery, which, according to the urban planning, is going to be torn down and turned into HDB estates by 2030. And she just has really eloquent insights into heritage in Singapore. And when you develop so rapidly, the need to have something physical that you can just hold on to. And Singapore has undergone such drastic economic transition over the past 50, 60 years that I can't even fathom what it looked like. I've been watching some old videos of Singapore on YouTube, so I can actually visualize it, but it's just such rapid change. And for Bukit Brown Cemetery, she is holding tours, but also she and a few other community leaders are helping Singaporeans find their ancestors' grave, like the tombstones. And to me, that's just such a organic and natural project of trying to discover your heritage and be aware of, you know, your family lines. And that in contrast to other spaces of nature in Singapore, which are very, very highly groomed. Vincent quotes an article by a sociologist that I just thought was a really trenchant way of describing the difference between a natural green space like Bukit Brown and an artificial, quote unquote, one. And he talks about Gardens by the Bay. And he talks about how you can draw national narratives from Bukit Brown because of, you know, the ancestry there and the cemetery, whereas the gardens encapsulates the hallmark of the global city: expensive, artificial, decontextualized, incredible, and primed for the tourist gaze. And so I think in this article, he's talking about how Bukit Brown is, quote unquote, an authentic space, whereas Gardens by the Bay is this huge, like this mega state project, which Singapore has several, which in general are lovely and beautiful and do attract tourism. But when it comes to the project of preserving heritage and deciding what should be conserved and what gets the state designation, there are places that I personally had never even heard of that maybe deserve that reverence more than what has just been sanctioned by the government as something special and beautiful. I'm going to rate this book. The rating system is all over the place. I really like this book, so I'm going to give it a 4.8 out of 5, I guess. Because all of the chapters are really short, and you don't have to read them in order, and you can even skip the ones that are not interesting to you. If you don't want to read about some architect or some urban planning guy, just skip it and read the ones that are interesting to you. I think there's plenty in here that you'll find something that you're interested in, and it will provide a much more nuanced and accurate picture of that issue in Singapore than what you can get from reading an article or from even talking to someone about it. So I highly recommend. And you can tell I've been trying like a new note-taking system, so this is not purely indicative of how much, I mean, this is a little ridiculous, so I'm probably not going to keep this note-taking system, but you can tell that there are a lot of things that I wanted to remember in this book, so I do recommend it if you're interested in Singapore. But anyway, I'm not saying there's no cost to being an activist in Singapore. There definitely is a cost, and I think I'm not saying there's no cost to being an activist in Singapore. There's definitely a cost, and oh my god. Right now, the guy next to me is singing. Anyway, I'm not saying there's no cost to being an activist in Singapore. There's definitely a cost. Oh my God, this truck. But I'm not saying there's not a cost to being an activist in Singapore. There's definitely a very heavy cost. Okay, I have to stop filming because literally there are a bunch of old Chinese uncles screaming at each other this morning. So let's just pause.